You know, some stories from history are so dark, so utterly incomprehensible, that entire governments would rather you never hear them. This is one of those stories. It happened in 1820, and it involves one of the most infamous maritime disasters in recorded history, the whale ship Essex from Nantucket, Massachusetts. What happened to this ship and its crew was so horrific, so surreal, that for years the United States authorities quietly buried all details. No official reports, no press coverage, just whispers among sailors and fragments of journals hidden in attics. And yet, here I am, telling you the story that they wanted buried. By the end, you'll understand exactly why it was kept secret for so long. The story begins in early September of 1819, when 20 men boarded the Essex. Most of them were young, full of energy, confidence, and a hunger for adventure. Some were seasoned sailors, hardened by years at sea. Others were fresh-faced lads, barely 20, dreaming of fortune and fame. Their mission was simple in theory: hunt sperm whales for their oil, sell it, and return to Nantucket richer than they had ever imagined. But the ocean is rarely governed by simplicity. It has its own rules, and it has a long memory. In the early days of the voyage, life on the Essex seemed almost idyllic, at least for men used to hardship. The ship cut through the Atlantic waves like a predator through calm water, and the crew went about their duties, mending sails, checking harpoons, scrubbing decks until their hands blistered. Nights were filled with camaraderie. Sailors huddled together below deck, smoking pipes, swapping stories, and laughing over shared meals of salted pork and hardtack. The smell of salt, sweat, and whale oil hung thick in the air. Each man had a routine, a role, a rhythm that made life at sea feel controlled, manageable. But even in those early days, subtle signs began to unsettle the crew. Strange sounds carried across the waves at night, howls and shrieks that seemed too deliberate to be wind. Shadows flickered across the horizon in patterns that defied reason. Sometimes it felt as if the ocean itself was observing them, testing their confidence. Some of the men whispered about bad omens while others tried to laugh it off. Yet the unease was there, growing like a dark cloud on the horizon, and no one could shake it. Weeks passed. The Atlantic gave way to the boundless expanse of the Pacific, a watery desert stretching further than the eye could see. Then, one morning, the crew spotted a sperm whale. But this was no ordinary whale. It was a colossal beast, over 80 feet long, scarred from countless battles with other whales, its enormous head rising and falling with each breath like a mountain breathing. Its eyes seemed to hold something impossible, a calculated intelligence, an awareness that chilled the men to their core. Awe and terror gripped them simultaneously. This creature was no animal. It was a force of nature, ancient and unyielding. Captain George Pollard, Jr., only 29, stood at the bow, staring down the monster. First Mate Owen Chase tightened his grip on the harpoon, knuckles white. The decision every whaler dreams of, or dreads, had to be made: to strike. The whaleboats were lowered. The men rowed into position, muscles coiled with adrenaline. For a fleeting moment, they believed themselves kings of the ocean, ready to conquer the greatest creature of the sea. And then it attacked. The whale moved with terrifying precision. Its massive body turned, and it charged. The impact was catastrophic. The Essex shuddered as oak splintered under the force, the mainmast snapped, rigging tore apart, and water gushed through the shattered hull. Men screamed. Some scrambled into the whaleboats. Others clung desperately to ropes and timbers as the deck pitched violently beneath them. The ocean had transformed into a predator, and the ship, once their protector, became their grave in motion. 20 men, experienced and confident, were suddenly powerless against the raw fury of nature. Only 3 small whaleboats survived. Each could barely hold 7 to 9 men. Everything else, provisions, tools, spare sails, personal belongings, was swallowed by the sea. They had nothing but what they could carry in the relentless, uncaring ocean surrounding them. From the first night, the psychological strain was immediate. The men huddled together in tiny boats, bodies pressed close for warmth, fear, and comfort. The sun scorched their skin, blistered and raw. Salt sores formed across their hands and legs. Lips cracked and bled. Thirst burned their throats like fire. At night, the wind seemed alive, whispering over the waves like the cries of the dead. Exhaustion and fear began to strip away their sense of reality. Days became weeks. The small rations of hardtack and salted meat ran low. Water, carefully rationed, was never enough. The men's hands shook, their arms ached from rowing, their backs sunburned and blistered. Salt mixed with blood and sweat to create a stench that clung to them day and night. Some men spoke to shadows, others stared silently at the horizon, eyes glazed with despair. Madness began to creep into even the strongest minds. Conversations turned to whispers, whispers to fearful suggestions, and suggestions into unthinkable thoughts. Death came slowly but inevitably. The first man succumbed to dehydration and exposure. There was no proper burial. The sea claimed him almost immediately. For the others, the reality sank in like a knife. The ocean was indifferent. It did not care about courage, skill, or youth. It demanded obedience and survival, and it demanded a price. And then the unimaginable began to take shape. I want you to picture it. 20 men, trapped in 3 tiny boats drifting across thousands of miles of water, with no land, no help, and no hope. Hunger, thirst, sun, salt, and fatigue became constant companions. As days wore on, the first thoughts that had been unthinkable started to appear in the minds of the men. Thoughts about the dead, about survival, about breaking the ultimate taboo. At first, it was only a fleeting, horrified notion. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became an ever-present shadow, whispering at the edges of their sanity. And yet, amidst all this, there were moments of fleeting human resilience. One man would spot a bird on the horizon and ignite hope. Another would carefully manage the water ration, insisting on fairness. They clung to routines where they could, singing songs quietly to ward off despair, murmuring prayers under the sun, gripping the mast and oars as if sheer will could keep them alive. But the ocean, patient and indifferent, watched silently. It did not care. It only waited. The Essex's secret, the secret authorities tried to hide for decades, was this. The ocean does not forgive mistakes. It does not reward courage or honor. It simply tests you, and then it watches as humans confront the darkest aspects of themselves. Hunger, thirst, fear, and desperation strip away layers of civility, revealing truths no one wants to face. And for the men of the Essex, those truths were about to become horrifyingly clear. By the end of the first chapter of their ordeal, the crew was already teetering on the brink. Their bodies were wasting away, their minds fraying at the edges. And yet, this was only the beginning. The choices they would face in the coming weeks, choices no human should have to make, would push them beyond morality, beyond comprehension, into a realm of survival so extreme it defies belief. In the next chapter, we will follow the men as their drift becomes a nightmare, as hunger, thirst. This is when the story of the Essex transforms from a maritime disaster into one of the most horrifying tales of human endurance and desperation ever recorded. After the Essex sank, everything changed in an instant. One moment, we had a ship. Our world, our safety, our floating home. The next, we had 3 tiny whaleboats, barely enough to hold 7 or 8 men each, drifting helplessly in the boundless Pacific. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a glassy, indifferent desert. The horizon mocked us. We were alive, yes, but only just, and the world we knew had vanished beneath the waves. I remember the first night vividly. The men huddled together, shivering from the shock of the sinking, from the cold that crept into our bones, from the fear we barely dared to speak aloud. Each splash of water against the boats sounded like doom, each wave threatening to overturn our fragile refuge. Sleep was impossible. Every groan, every movement was amplified, every cough a signal that someone might not make it to morning. The ocean was no longer a playground. It had become a predator, patient and relentless. We tried to organize. We rationed the few biscuits and scraps of salted meat we had managed to salvage. Water was even more precious, measured in spoonfuls, passed cautiously from hand to hand. Some of the men prayed, others cursed, and a few simply stared at the horizon with wide, empty eyes, as if staring long enough could somehow bring land to us. But land did not come. Only endless water. Only the merciless sun. The first week passed slowly, agonizingly. Rowing became a constant effort, exhausting in the heat, the salt burning our hands raw. Each night we huddled together, trying to share warmth and a sense of safety, but the cold crept in, and the reality of our situation settled like a stone in the pit of the stomach. Hunger began to gnaw relentlessly. Water dried up too quickly. Lips cracked, skin blistered. Men vomited from heat, salt, and exhaustion. And yet, there was no relief. Only the ocean, unchanging, infinite, and merciless. Then the deaths began. The first man succumbed quietly, almost imperceptibly. We buried him at sea, a small ceremony with murmured words, but it felt hollow, empty. There was no comfort, no solace. The others were shaken, but we forced ourselves to continue. That first death was a grim reminder. The ocean does not forgive mistakes. It takes what it wants, and it does so without malice, without care. Only indifference. And soon we realized we would be tested in ways no human should be. As days turned into weeks, the physical toll became unbearable. Hands cracked and bled from rowing, muscles wasted from hunger, skin raw from sunburn. Thirst burned in our throats like fire. Some men hallucinated, seeing phantom islands, hearing voices in the waves. The line between reality and imagination blurred. Desperation was no longer just a feeling. It was a living, breathing entity, whispering in every thought, urging us toward choices no sane man would ever consider. I remember the moment the first argument broke out. 2 men began shouting over a scrap of biscuit. Fear magnified every action. Small disagreements became battles of life and death. The rules of society, of morality, even of friendship, no longer applied. We were reduced to primal instincts. Survive. That was all that mattered. And the ocean watched silently as it pushed us toward the unimaginable. By the 3rd week, the first signs of truly desperate thinking emerged. We were rationing every drop of water, every crumb of food. The body's instincts became sharper than reason. A glance at the dead man's body floating nearby sparked something in us. Something terrifying and almost unspoken. At first, it was just a thought, a whisper we pushed aside. But the whisper grew louder each day, persistent, insistent. Survival demanded decisions that no man should have to make. And yet, the question lingered. Would we be strong enough to resist? Or would the ocean force our hands? Sleep became a torment. The men huddled together, bodies overlapping, sharing warmth, yet unable to find comfort. Dreams were filled with the ocean swallowing us whole, with whales attacking, with our friends turning into monsters. Some muttered in their sleep, screaming or crying. Others stared blankly into the water, rocking themselves back and forth. Madness was creeping in like a tide we could not hold back, and the ocean remained indifferent. Even the elements seemed to conspire against us. Storms arose with little warning, waves towering over our tiny boats. Rain lashed down, soaking everything, yet it brought no relief. The cold seeped in, the sun scorched, and the salt water burned open sores across our skin. Every day was an endurance test. Every moment was a negotiation with pain, with exhaustion, with fear. We were alive, but barely, and the price of survival was mounting. Food was gone. Water was scarce. The dead began to accumulate. Each loss weighed heavier than the last, not just physically, but psychologically. Every glance at a comrade became a judgment. Who would endure? Who would falter? And who would be forced to cross lines that should never be crossed? Even I felt it, the creeping, gnawing fear that our minds would turn against us, that the code we lived by on land meant nothing out here. The ocean was erasing all rules. By the end of the month, desperation had transformed from a concept into a living, oppressive force. Men whispered about the impossible, about acts that in the civilized world would be unthinkable. Every day, it became clear that only one truth governed us: survival. And survival did not care about morals, friendship, or conscience. It cared about hunger, thirst, strength, and the cruel timing of death. And still, hope flickered. A bird on the horizon, a wave breaking in a pattern that suggested land, a memory of home. These were the fragile anchors we clung to. They were not much, but they were enough to keep rowing, keep fighting, keep thinking that perhaps, somehow, we could survive this hellish drift. But the truth was undeniable. The ocean had already begun shaping us, testing us, stripping away civility layer by layer. And in the weeks to come, we would be forced to confront choices so horrifying that even mentioning them would have seemed impossible on shore. This was the stage where ordinary men would meet desperation face to face, and the ocean would observe silently, indifferent to what happened next. In the next chapter, we will descend further into that nightmare. We will witness the erosion of sanity, the first acts of horrifying survival, and the unthinkable decisions that would define the legacy of the Essex forever. By the time the third week of our drift began, the reality of our situation had become impossible to ignore. The ocean, endless and indifferent, stretched in every direction, a vast, unyielding expanse that seemed to mock us. We had no ship, no shelter, barely enough food and water to sustain us, and no land in sight. The sun beat down relentlessly during the day, baking our skin to raw, blistered leather, while at night the cold crept into our bones, leaving us shivering and broken. Every moment was a test of endurance, every breath a fragile victory over the despair that surrounded us. Hunger had become more than a sensation. It was a living, breathing presence, gnawing at our minds as much as our stomachs. Each biscuit, each drop of water, was rationed meticulously, measured by trembling hands. The men were reduced to shadows of themselves, faces sunken, eyes hollowed, bodies covered in sores from the sun, salt, and the constant chafing of our tiny boats. Every glance we cast at one another carried an unspoken question. How far would we go to survive? Then came the first death. A young sailor, barely 20, succumbed to dehydration and exposure. His body, once full of life, went limp in the water, and we could do nothing but watch. We tried to give him a proper burial at sea, pushing him into the waves with whispered prayers, but the ritual felt hollow, almost meaningless. The ocean had claimed him, and the rest of us felt the cold reality. We were utterly at the mercy of this indifferent world. And it was in the wake of that first death that the unthinkable began to emerge. Desperation is a dangerous companion, and the human mind, when pushed to the edge, begins to consider possibilities that would have been unimaginable on land. Whispers started among the men. Whispers about the dead, about survival, about things that no decent man should ever contemplate. At first, we dismissed them. Surely, we thought no one could truly entertain such thoughts. Yet the seed had been planted, and it grew with each passing day, nurtured by hunger, exhaustion, and the oppressive vastness of the ocean. Our rations dwindled. Water became nearly non-existent, and the relentless sun burned us alive while waves soaked us to the bone. Skin peeled, lips cracked, eyes burned from salt, and every movement required unimaginable effort. Hallucinations began to creep into our minds. Some of the men swore they saw land in the distance, only to row toward illusions. Others spoke to the dead, naming them, begging them, bargaining with the ocean itself. And through it all, the whispers grew louder. The tension among the men reached a breaking point. Arguments erupted over the smallest scraps of food, over water, over who would row and who would rest. Every disagreement was magnified by the sheer desperation of our situation. Friendships, forged over years at sea, began to fray. Trust became fragile. Every glance, every word carried weight, every mistake could mean death. And then, in a moment none of us will ever forget, necessity forced our hand. Another sailor, weakened to the brink, died quietly, and the question arose, the unthinkable question, that had been whispered in the shadows. What will we do to survive? For the first time, the men faced the moral chasm that would define the rest of our drift. Hunger demanded a choice, and the ocean demanded compliance. It was as if the very waves were whispering, "Choose or perish." I can still remember the silence that fell over the boats, the kind of silence that presses down so heavily it feels physical. The men avoided each other's eyes, each man wrestling with his own conscience, his own fear, his own desperation. And then the first decision was made. It was quiet, almost ceremonious, the way the living acknowledge the dead and the impossible. We were not monsters, not yet, but the ocean had already begun to strip away everything else. In the days that followed, survival became a brutal, mechanical act. Every movement, every bite of meager food, every sip of water was a negotiation with exhaustion, with pain, with morality itself. The dead were no longer just numbers. They were potential lifelines. And as the days turned into weeks, the idea that had once seemed unspeakable became a grim reality we could not deny. Yet, even in this darkness, there were fleeting moments of humanity. Men shared memories of home, of family, of warmth and laughter long forgotten. Some offered a comforting word to the dying, a hand to steady a trembling comrade. These moments were small, fragile, but they reminded us that we were still human, barely, and that the ocean had not yet claimed our souls completely. And still, the ocean waited, patient, indifferent, eternal. It offered no reprieve, no mercy, only the relentless testing of our endurance, our sanity, and our morality. Each day the line between civilization and savagery blurred further until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. By the end of this chapter of our ordeal, the men were shadows, physically broken and mentally fraying at the edges. Hunger and thirst had become constant companions. The ocean had stripped away all pretense of normalcy, leaving only the raw calculus of survival. And the choices that lay ahead in the weeks to come would push us further into the abyss than any man should ever be pushed. forcing us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature in the cold, endless Pacific. By the fourth week, our situation had deteriorated beyond anything I could have imagined. The ocean, vast and unyielding, stretched endlessly in every direction, a boundless expanse of blue that seemed to mock our existence. We were nothing but 3 tiny whaleboats, carrying men who were shadows of their former selves, battered by the sun, salt, and the merciless waves. Each day brought new suffering, each night a chilling reminder that the world beyond the horizon was as indifferent as it was endless. We were starving. Thirst gnawed at our throats, each swallow of seawater, bitter and brackish, burning like acid. Our hands were cracked and raw from rowing, our skin blistered, peeling and burned by the relentless sun. Lips split, eyes red and swollen, and salt sores covered our bodies, an unending torment that refused to heal. The air itself seemed to hum with the desperation of men at the very edge of sanity. Hunger had become a living, breathing thing. It whispered constantly, gnawing at our minds as much as our bellies. We rationed the few biscuits we had left with trembling hands, sharing them with silent, solemn reverence. Every drop of water was measured meticulously, passed with whispered instructions and fear. I remember the dread in the eyes of my companions, the way their gaze lingered on the dwindling supplies as if those small crumbs contained the difference between life and death. And then came the first death that would change everything. A young sailor, barely 20, collapsed silently into the ocean's embrace, his body no longer moving, his eyes empty. There was no time for mourning. We pushed his lifeless form into the waves with whispered prayers, but the ritual felt hollow. The ocean claimed him without malice, without intention, and the rest of us were left to confront the impossible. Survival demanded a choice that would forever alter our understanding of humanity. At first, the thought was unspoken. We did not dare say it aloud. The ocean was silent, vast, and indifferent, and yet it seemed to watch us, waiting. Then the whispers began. They were quiet at first, shadows at the edges of our minds. Could it sustain us? Would it save us? The words were not spoken but understood, a dark realization that lurked behind every glance. And then the first decision was made. We turned to the dead. I will never forget the horror of that moment. The sun glared overhead, merciless, while the waves slapped against our boats like giant hands, indifferent and cruel. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and something far darker now, the meat of our fallen companion. Every motion was mechanical, every breath weighed down by disbelief and shame. I remember the texture, the way it felt alien and necessary at the same time, and the silence that followed, broken only by the occasional sob or cough. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Men avoided each other's eyes, muttered prayers, and cursed fate and the ocean alike. Madness crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but it was relentless. Hallucinations became common. One man swore he saw his deceased father waving from a distant shore. Another imagined the ocean was speaking, threatening to claim him next. Some began to whisper constantly, their words strange and incomprehensible, while others withdrew entirely, staring blankly into the horizon, unmoving and silent. Conflict became inevitable. Food scraps, water drops, even the smallest ration of flesh sparked arguments. Fear magnified every disagreement. Friends became enemies in the blink of an eye. Men accused one another of hoarding, of weakness, of cowardice. Every glance was heavy with suspicion. Trust, which had been forged over years of camaraderie and shared labor, dissolved like sugar in the sun. We were no longer a crew. We were a collection of desperate souls, each fighting not only the ocean but the darkness within ourselves. As the days passed, the horror escalated. Each meal became a calculated act, a negotiation between morality and survival. We counted every scrap of food as though it were gold, every drop of water as though it were life itself. Nights were the worst. Sleep offered no relief, only dreams filled with screaming, drowning, and the faces of the lost. Some men screamed in their sleep, others wept silently. The ocean was a constant witness, its waves a relentless reminder of our insignificance. Hunger and thirst had warped us completely. Even the most devout men muttered blasphemies. Gentle souls hardened. Laughter disappeared. The smallest acts of kindness became impossible, replaced by calculation and survival instinct. Every day the line between civilization and savagery blurred further, and with each passing hour, the weight of our actions pressed down on our minds like a physical force, unrelenting, crushing, inevitable. Yet amidst the horror, flickers of humanity persisted. A man would quietly comfort another, offer a few words of reassurance, a touch on the shoulder, a shared memory of home. These moments were brief, fleeting, fragile, yet they reminded us that we were still human, even if the ocean sought to strip that humanity away. The sun rose and set, waves crashed, and the days merged into nights. We could no longer distinguish time. The rhythm of our existence became rowing, rationing, surviving, and mourning the dead. Each breath was an effort. Each stroke of the oar, each gulp of brackish water, each morsel of food was negotiated with the ocean itself. It demanded our endurance, our sanity, our very souls, and we offered them bit by bit, piece by piece, because there was no alternative. As the fourth week wore on, despair became a living entity aboard the boats. Men whispered about the dead, about acts that would have been unimaginable on land. Morality had been stripped away by necessity. Every decision, every bite, every choice between life and death was a negotiation with a silent, indifferent ocean. And yet the human mind, resilient and stubborn, clung to hope, to memories of home, to the possibility of survival, however slim. By the end of the fourth week, we were nothing like the men who had left Nantucket. Bodies wasted, skin burned and blistered, eyes hollowed and haunted, minds frayed, morality eroded, every thought consumed by the primal instinct to survive. The ocean had claimed its toll, not just on our bodies but on our humanity. And in the weeks to come, the choices that remained would push us further, demanding acts that no man should ever commit, forcing each of us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. The ocean was patient, eternal, indifferent, a silent judge of our descent. And within that silence, the true horror of survival revealed itself. Hunger, thirst, fear, madness, and desperation had converged into a single, crushing reality. We were trapped on a vast, unfeeling sea, and the cost of survival was unthinkable. In the next chapter, we will witness the final descent into chaos, the last acts of desperation, the edge of human morality, and the harrowing journey toward rescue. We will see the full cost of the Essex's drift, a story so horrific that it has haunted the seas, the survivors, and history itself for centuries. The day we saw land again, I thought I might cry. After weeks adrift, after the sun had burned our skin to leather, after thirst and hunger had gnawed at our bodies and minds, the sight of something solid, something unmoving, something that did not shift with the waves, felt like a miracle. It was a small island, barely more than a jagged outline against the sky, yet it was the first promise of salvation we had glimpsed in what felt like an eternity. We approached it cautiously. The men were skeletal, sunken-eyed, trembling with exhaustion and fear. Each stroke of the oar was agony, each breath a reminder of how fragile life had become. Some of us wept silently, others stared blankly, the trauma of weeks at sea pressing down like a physical weight. The ocean had left its mark on us in ways that no sailor could have imagined. The first landfall was bittersweet, relief mixed with the shame of survival. We were alive, yes, but at what cost? The acts we had been forced to commit, the horrors we had witnessed and participated in, clung to us as tightly as the salt that crusted our skin. Even as we stumbled onto the sand, we were not free. The ocean's grip had not loosened. It had merely changed form, leaving us to confront the aftermath. Rescue came slowly. A passing ship, alerted by the smoke from our makeshift fire, spotted us and brought us aboard. For the first time in weeks, we were given food, water, blankets, things that had once seemed mundane, now miraculous. The sailors who rescued us looked at our emaciated, broken forms with a mixture of pity and disbelief. We were alive, yet only just. Our bodies were frail, our skin scorched and blistered, our eyes haunted by the ordeal. Yet the physical toll was only part of the story. The psychological scars ran far deeper. Memories of the dead, the decisions we had been forced to make, the acts we could not unsee or unhear, all lingered, heavy and relentless. At night, some men would wake screaming, clutching at their sheets, haunted by the faces of those they had lost, or worse, by the reality of what they had done to survive. The shame was pervasive. It clung to us, unshakable, a shadow that no amount of rescue could dispel. Back in Nantucket, the story of the Essex became both legend and secret. Officials and authorities were wary of publicizing the full truth. How could they explain the horror of men resorting to cannibalism, the mental collapse, the sheer terror of survival in the vast Pacific? For decades, details were obscured, journal entries tucked away, accounts edited, silenced, or softened. The authorities understood something the rest of the world could not. Some truths are too terrible to confront. We survivors lived with the memory every day. Even mundane acts, a meal, a sip of water, the sight of a whale or a storm at sea, could trigger flashbacks. The ocean, vast and merciless, was no longer just a place. It was a memory, a presence, a lingering judgment. Our nights were haunted. Some of us never spoke of it openly, while others tried to write, to record, to make sense of what had happened. Every recounting was a struggle, every word a confrontation with our own guilt and shame. Yet, despite it all, life continued. We rebuilt, worked, married, had families, but the Essex was never far from our minds. Its story, the horror we endured, the acts we were forced to commit, all became a dark thread woven into the fabric of our lives. And in moments of quiet, when the wind carried the smell of salt or the sea crashed against a distant shore, I could still feel the ocean's silent gaze, the test that never truly ends, the reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. The legacy of the Essex was twofold: a testament to the will to survive, and a warning about the depths to which humanity can descend when pushed beyond the edge. The men who returned were alive, but haunted. Their bodies healed, but their minds bore scars that would never fade. And even as authorities buried parts of our story, leaving only fragments in journals and second-hand accounts, the truth remained. The ocean does not forgive. It does not forget, and the darkness it forced upon us is a shadow that lingers, even in the light. In the end, the Essex is more than a tale of survival. It is a mirror, reflecting the fragility of human morality, the power of desperation, and the enduring shadow of nature's indifference. The story was silenced, edited, and contained, yet it persists, in journals, in accounts, and in the memory of those who survived. And perhaps that is the most chilling part. Even with rescue, even with return, even with life restored, some experiences are too vast, too terrible, too final to ever truly leave us. The Essex's journey ended with land, with rescue, and with life, yet it left behind a lesson written in flesh, bone, and memory. Survival came at a cost that no man could quantify, and for those of us who lived, the ocean's silence remained the loudest voice of all, reminding us always of the edge we had walked, the darkness we had faced, and the secrets that authorities and history alike would rather leave buried.